The millionaire proposed to the pregnant Maid to protect his reputation, but she refused. The flash of the cameras exploded like a storm of light as Brandon Foster emerged from the Foster Enterprises building in Manhattan. His normally impassive face betrayed signs of tension as reporters shouted questions about the latest scandal that threatened to tarnish not only his name, but his family's entire reputation. Mr. Foster, is it true that Foster Enterprises is involved in illegal transactions with shell companies? Brandon, how do you respond to the accusations of tax fraud? Mr. Foster, there are rumors about compromising documents. His assistant, Marcus Chun, made his way through the crowd of journalists, leading Brandon to the waiting limousine. As soon as the doors closed, Brandon loosened his navy blue tie and ran his fingers through his perfectly aligned brown hair. We need a quick solution, Marcus. The stock is down 12% since that story leaked. Marcus consulted his tablet. I have an idea that might work. Alexandra Winters. Brandon frowned when he heard the name. Alexandra was the marketing director of the rival company, Winters Communications, known as much for her competence as for her unwavering integrity. At 32, she had built up a solid reputation in the market, although Brandon suspected there was more to her story than met the eye. What about her? A strategic marriage to Alexandra could silence the rumors. She has the perfect reputation, comes from a good family, and a union between Foster and Winters would be seen as a consolidation move in the market. Brandon watched the New York traffic through the tinted window. The idea wasn't absurd. In fact, it made sense from a business point of view. Make a dinner date. The next day, at the exclusive Per Se restaurant, Alexandra Winters adjusted her black dress as she waited at the private table. Her natural red hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her green eyes scanned the menu without actually reading it. She knew exactly why Brandon Foster had requested this meeting. Brandon arrived punctually at 8, his tailored gray suit accentuating his athletic figure. Alexandra, you look stunning. Brandon, let's skip the formalities. Why am I here? He smiled, appreciating her frankness. Straight to the point then. I have a business proposal. I thought it was dinner. It's more than that. Brandon leaned forward, lowering his voice. I want to propose a mutually beneficial arrangement. A marriage. Alexandra almost knocked over a glass of water. Pardon? Think of it as a merger. Your impeccable reputation, my resources. Together, we could create something extraordinary. The waiter appeared to take their orders, giving Alexandra a few moments to process the absurd proposal. When they were alone again, she met Brandon's blue eyes. Are you asking me to sacrifice my integrity to save your reputation? I'm offering a partnership. You would have access to resources that Winters Communications never dreamed of having. Alexandra felt a shiver run down her spine. If Brandon had known what she had discovered during her last internal audit, he wouldn't be making this offer. The encrypted file on his laptop contained information that could not only bring down Brandon Foster, but expose a network of corruption that stretched across several major corporations. I'm not a commodity to be traded, Brandon, and you should know that there are more important things than money and power. Like what? Truth, integrity, doing the right thing even when no one is looking. Brandon leaned back, studying her with renewed interest. You're hiding something, Alexandra. I can see it in your eyes. She kept her face neutral, years of corporate negotiations having taught her to mask her emotions. We all have our secrets, Brandon. Some are better kept that way. Dinner continued with superficial conversations about the market and mutual acquaintances, but the tension remained palpable. When dessert arrived, Brandon made his final attempt. Think of the impact we could have together. The possibilities are endless. Alexandra placed her napkin on the table and stood up. Possibilities built on lies have no future, Brandon. My answer is no. As she walked out of the restaurant, Brandon couldn't imagine that in his Upper East Side apartment, hidden in a digital safe, was the document that could destroy everything he had built. Alexandra got into her car, her hands shaking slightly as she gripped the steering wheel. The driver watched her through the rearview mirror. Oh, Ms. Winters? No, Paricha. To the office. I have something important to take care of. As the car glided through the bright streets of Manhattan, Alexandra thought about the irony of the situation. Brandon Foster had just offered her a deal to protect her reputation, without having any idea that she held in her hands the power to destroy it completely. In his apartment later that evening, Brandon poured himself a whiskey while gazing out over the city. The cell phone rang. It was Marcus. "She turned you down?" "Yes, but there's something else. Something she's not saying. Do you want me to investigate?" Brandon swirled the amber liquid in the glass, watching the city lights reflected in the crystal. "Yes. Find out everything about Alexander Winters. Every detail. Every secret." What he didn't know was that this decision would start a chain of events that would forever change not only their lives, but the entire corporate landscape of New York. Alexander sat in her office at Winters Communications, the encrypted file glowing on her laptop like a digital time bomb. Brandon's proposal still echoed in her mind, a mixture of arrogance and desperation that she recognized all too well. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered her options. The soft sound of knocks on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Grace Martinez, her assistant for 5 years and closest confidant, entered with a cup of chamomile tea. "I thought you might need this. Was dinner that bad?" "Brandon Foster asked me to marry him." Alexandra accepted the cup, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. Grace almost knocked over her own cup. "He what?" "A marriage of convenience, of course. To save his reputation after the scandal." Alexander swiveled in her chair to face the night view of Manhattan. What he doesn't know is that the real scandal is yet to come. Grace closed the office door and sat down. "Are you really going to go through with this? Expose everything?" Alexandra opened a locked drawer in her desk and took out a USB stick. "What we've discovered goes beyond Foster Enterprises. There are at least 5 other major corporations involved in an international money laundering scheme. Millions of dollars embezzled through shell companies. And now he wants to marry you." Grace shook her head in disbelief. The irony is almost poetic. A ping from the computer alerted Alexandra to a new email. It was from Marcus Chun, Brandon's assistant. "Mr. Foster would like to reschedule another dinner to discuss possible collaborations between our companies." Alexandra felt a shiver of apprehension. Brandon wasn't the type to give up easily, and she knew he would start investigating. It was only a matter of time before he discovered that she had led the secret audit that revealed the whole operation. "Grace, I need you to do something for me." Alexandra handed the USB stick to her assistant. "Take this home and keep it in a safe place. It's our insurance policy." Meanwhile, in the Foster Enterprises office, Brandon was immersed in reports on Alexander Winters. Marcus had gathered the basic information. Graduated with honors from Harvard, meteoric rise at Winters Communications, impeccable reputation in the market. "There's got to be more," Brandon muttered, running his fingers across the tablet screen. "Nobody's that perfect." His phone rang. It was Richard Montgomery, an old friend from the FBI who occasionally did discreet favors. "Brandon, that background check you requested on Alexander Winters. I found something interesting. 3 years ago, she made several undocumented trips to the Cayman Islands." Brandon straightened up in his chair. The Cayman Islands were known for their discreet banks and bank secrecy laws. "Go on." "And for the last 6 months, she's been meeting regularly with a former employee of Foster Enterprises, Michael Reynolds." The name hit Brandon like a punch in the gut. Michael Reynolds had been financial director of Foster Enterprises until he abruptly resigned a year ago. At the time, Brandon hadn't questioned much. Executives came and went all the time. "I need more information about these meetings." "I'm already on it," Richard replied. "But Brandon, be careful. There are rumors circulating in certain circles. Important people are nervous." After hanging up, Brandon gazed out at the city through the windows of his office. The empire that his father had built and that he had expanded was under threat, and somehow Alexander Winters was at the center of it all. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the office early, surprised to find a huge arrangement of white orchids on her desk. The card said only, "Reconsider. BF." She was about to throw the arrangement in the garbage when her phone rang. It was Michael Reynolds. "Alexandra, we have a problem. Someone is asking questions about our meetings." Brandon: "Yes. He has contacts at the FBI. It won't take long to find out everything." Alexandra closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her choices. How long do we have? Days, maybe. We need to act now. No, Alexandra looked at the orchids, a symbol of Brandon's arrogance. Not yet. We have to make sure we catch everyone involved. There can't be anyone left to rebuild the scheme afterwards. After hanging up, Alexandra called Grace. I need you to prepare all the documents. It's time to get the Securities and Exchange Commission involved. Grace hesitated. Are you sure? Once we start this, there's no turning back. Alexandra added, I know, but some things are more important than reputations and corporate empires. Later that day, as the sun set over Manhattan, Brandon Foster and Alexandra Winters were in their respective offices, each planning their next move. What had begun as a simple marriage proposal was about to turn into a battle that would shake the foundations of the American corporate world. Brandon looked once more at the photo of Alexandra on his tablet, studying her green eyes that seemed to hold so many secrets. What are you hiding, Alexandra Winters? In her own office, Alexandra opened the encrypted file once more, the numbers and names dancing before her eyes. Somewhere in that city, other people like her were fighting corruption and greed. She wouldn't leave them to fight alone. The sun finally set over New York, leaving the city lights shining like earthly stars. The night promised to be long, and the following days would be even longer. The truth, like a force of nature, was about to come out, and no corporate power would be able to contain it. In the makeshift war room on the 42nd floor of Foster Enterprises, Brandon Foster watched a digital screen that took up the entire wall, displaying a complex network of financial connections and transactions. Marcus Chun pointed to different nodes of the diagram, explaining his findings about Alexandra Winters. Over the past 3 months, she has coordinated a series of meetings with former employees of various corporations, not just Foster Enterprises. The pattern is systematic. Marcus enlarged a section of the diagram, and all these people have something in common. They worked in finance departments. Brandon ran his hand over his chin, studying the patterns that emerged. She's building a case against us. But why? What's her connection to all this? There's more. Marcus hesitated briefly. We found out that her father, Jonathan Winters, was investigating similar irregularities before his sudden death 5 years ago. Silence weighed on the room as Brandon processed the information. Jonathan Winters had been a titan of the communications industry, respected and feared in equal measure. His death from natural causes had always generated speculation in corporate circles. At the same moment, on the other side of town, Alexandra was in a discreet coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from the watchful eyes of Manhattan. Michael Reynolds sat across from her, sliding a brown envelope across the table. I found this in your father's old files, Michael said quietly. He was closer to the truth than we imagined. The money laundering scheme started over a decade ago. Alexandra opened the envelope with trembling hands. Her father's handwritten notes filled pages and pages, connecting dots that she herself had begun to join in recent months. Brandon is investigating you, Michael continued. He has people following each of us. We need to accelerate our timeline. We can't rush it, Alexandra replied, carefully putting the documents away in her briefcase. If we make a single mistake, they'll bury everything again, just like they did with my father. Back at Foster Enterprises, Brandon was receiving a disturbing call from Richard Montgomery of the FBI. Brandon, you need to stop investigating Alexandra Winters. Immediately. Why? Because you're not the only one interested in her. There's a federal investigation underway, and you're running the risk of interfering in an official operation. Brandon felt his blood run cold. How much time do we have? Days, maybe hours. The siege is closing in, Brandon. And this time, not even your contacts in Washington will be able to help. In her office at Winters Communications, Grace hurried in with a laptop in her hands. Alexandra, you need to see this. Someone tried to access our secure servers. They left digital traces everywhere. Alexandra examined the security logs. Amateurs. They're desperate. What do we do now? Activate the protocol we've prepared. It's time to spread the information to all our contacts in the media. If anything happens to me— Don't talk like that, Grace interrupted. If something happens to me, Alexander continued firmly, you know what to do. All the documents, all the evidence, everything automatically goes to the right people. In Brandon's penthouse, as night fell over New York, he studied old photos of Jonathan Winters. One in particular caught his eye. Jonathan and his own father, Robert Foster, at a gala party 6 years ago. Both smiling at the camera, apparently close friends. Less than a year later, Jonathan was dead. His phone vibrated with a message from Alexandra. Tomorrow, 7 Uhr morgens, Pier 17, come alone. Brandon stared at the message for several long minutes. Was it a trap, or finally a chance to understand what was going on? In her Upper East Side apartment, Alexandra was preparing for the confrontation she knew was inevitable. On her dining table, old photos of her father lay scattered like pieces of a puzzle she was finally completing. "You were right all along, Dad," she muttered to herself. "And tomorrow, everyone will know." The evening progressed, and in different parts of the city, important people received encrypted emails, ready to be opened at a specific time the next morning. Alexandra had planned everything meticulously, like a game of chess where each piece needed to move at exactly the right moment. Grace, in her small apartment in Queens, made backup after backup of the crucial files, sending them to secure servers in different countries. Michael Reynolds checked every detail of the financial documents they had collected over the months. And somewhere, federal agents were preparing for the biggest corporate corruption case of the decade. Dawn was approaching, bringing with it the promise of a day that would change the American corporate landscape forever. Brandon Foster and Alexandra Winters, two pawns in a game much bigger than they imagined, were about to discover that some truths are too heavy to carry alone. The morning mist hung over the East River when Alexandra arrived at Pier 17. The sun was still struggling to emerge over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gray. She had chosen this spot on purpose, public enough to guarantee her safety, but secluded enough for a frank conversation. Brandon was already there, leaning on his black Aston Martin, his impeccable Italian suit contrasting with the rusticity of the pier. His eyes met Alexandra's as she approached, her heels echoing on the wooden planks. "You have the nerve to come here alone, after all your planning," Brandon said, his calm voice masking the underlying tension. Alexandra stopped a few meters away from him. "I'm not the one who should be afraid, Brandon." In approximately, she consulted her wristwatch, 45 minutes, every major media outlet will receive a file detailing the entire money laundering operation, including the role of Foster Enterprises. "In your father's role in all this?" Brandon countered, watching as Alexandra stiffened slightly. "Oh yes, I found out about Jonathan Winters. He wasn't as innocent as you think." "Don't you dare talk about my father," Alexandra hissed, taking a step forward. "He discovered the truth and paid for it with his life." "The truth is more complicated than you think, Alexandra. Your father wasn't a victim. He was an active participant until he decided he wanted more." A fishing boat passed in the distance, its horn cutting through the morning air. Alexandra took a tablet out of her bag, typed in a password, and showed Brandon a series of documents. "Explain this then." "Transfers to accounts in the Cayman Islands, shell companies, doctor records, all with Foster Enterprises' digital signature." Brandon examined the documents, his face losing a little color. "Where did you get these?" "Your former CFO wasn't as careful as he should have been. Michael Reynolds kept copies of everything." "Reynolds?" Brandon laughed bitterly. "He's manipulating you, Alexandra. Reynolds was the architect of the whole scheme. When we found out what he was doing, he ran off with millions." Alexandra felt a twinge of doubt, but kept her composure. "I have independent evidence, documents that my father gathered before he died." "Your father?" Brandon hesitated, running his hand over his face. "There's something you need to see." He took out his own phone and showed Alexandra a security video from 5 years ago. In it, Jonathan Winters was arguing heatedly with Michael Reynolds in an underground parking garage. "This was 3 days before his death," Brandon explained. "Reynolds threatened to expose your father if he didn't increase his participation in the scheme." Alexandra felt her legs go weak. Grace had checked Reynolds' background, but maybe they had missed something crucial. Sirens began to sound in the distance, rapidly approaching. "Did you call the police?" Alexandra asked, taking a step back. "No," Brandon replied, also becoming alert. But someone did. FBI cars appeared at both ends of the pier, armed agents emerging with guns drawn. FBI, nobody move! Alexandra and Brandon froze in place, watching stunned as Michael Reynolds stepped out of one of the cars, now wearing an FBI vest. Michael Reynolds, FBI special agent, he announced, flashing his badge. Brandon Foster, you're under arrest for money laundering, tax fraud, and conspiracy. You. Alexander looked at Michael, understanding finally dawning. You used us? Me and my father. I'm sorry, Alexandra, Michael said, genuinely sorry. We needed someone on the inside, someone with access and motivation. Your father refused to cooperate, but you gave us exactly what we needed. Brandon was handcuffed and led to one of the cars, while Alexandra stood motionless, feeling her world crumble. Everything she had believed about her father's death, about her mission of justice, was being rewritten before her eyes. Ms. Winters, an agent, approached her. We'll need your full statement. Alexandra watched as the sun finally emerged in full, illuminating the waters of the East River. Somewhere in that city, Grace would be getting the news. The files would have already been sent, and a media storm was about to erupt. I'll cooperate, she finally said. But first, I want to know exactly what happened to my father. As she was led to one of the FBI cars, Alexandra took one last look at Brandon, who was watching her through the window of the police car. Their gazes met briefly, sharing a moment of mutual understanding. They had both been pieces in a much bigger game than they had imagined. The morning sun continued its ascent over Manhattan, indifferent to the drama unfolding under its light. In offices all over the city, executives would start receiving notifications on their phones about the scandal that was about to shake Wall Street to its foundations. And somewhere, secrets buried 5 years ago would finally begin to rise to the surface. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Alexander sat in the cold room of the FBI office in Manhattan, reliving every moment of the last few months as she answered the agent's endless questions. Her mind, however, kept going back to that video Brandon had shown her, her father and Michael Reynolds in the parking lot. Ms. Winters, Special Agent Sarah Coleman, closed her briefcase. We need to discuss your father's role in all of this. Alexandra straightened up in her uncomfortable chair. You used his death to manipulate me. Not exactly. Coleman slid a folder across the table. His father was working with us. He was an informant. The words hit Alexander like a punch in the gut. Inside the folder, there were photos, reports, and transcripts of meetings. Her father meticulously documenting the illegal activities he uncovered. Why didn't he ever tell me? To protect you. Jonathan knew that the less you knew, the safer you'd be. Coleman hesitated before continuing. His death wasn't natural, Alexandra. It was murder. On the other side of the building, Brandon Foster was facing his own interrogation. His lawyer, David Schwartz, had arrived minutes after his arrest, but even his presence couldn't ease the gravity of the situation. Mr. Foster, Special Agent James Martinez, placed a series of documents on the table. We found records of transfers to an account in the Bahamas linked to you. Care to explain? Brandon looked at his lawyer, who nodded discreetly. That account belonged to my father. I only found out about it after his death 2 years ago. And you continued the operations? I had no choice. The scheme was bigger than we imagined. If I stopped abruptly, the whole system would collapse. In her office at Winters Communications, Grace was facing an invasion of reporters. News of Brandon Foster's arrest and the company's involvement in an international money laundering scheme had leaked to the media. Her phone rang. It was Michael Reynolds. Grace, I need you to keep all the files safe. We're not finished yet. How could you lie to her? Grace lashed out. Alexandra trusted you. Sometimes we need to use questionable methods to achieve a greater good. Back in the interrogation room, Alexandra was examining her father's latest notes. One sentence stood out. Robert Foster is not the real mastermind behind this. What does that mean? She asked Agent Coleman. Your father discovered that there was someone above the Fosters controlling the whole operation. Someone with powerful political connections. That's why he started working with us. Alexandra felt a shiver run down her spine. And, do you know who that is? We have suspicions. That's why we need your help, Alexandra. You have access to information that even your father couldn't get. In the corridor, Brandon was being led into another room when their gazes met again. This time, there was something different in his gaze. No longer arrogance or defiance, but a shared understanding. 5 minutes, Brandon asked the agents. After a brief consultation, they allowed the two to talk in a conference room, under supervision. Your father was trying to protect us, Brandon began as soon as the door closed. All of us. From what? From hope. There's someone in Washington, someone with enough power to make people disappear. My father found out, tried to get away, and Brandon didn't need to finish the sentence. Alexander felt the pieces falling into place. That's why you proposed marriage. It wasn't just for your reputation, it was to keep me close, to protect me. I knew you were investigating. I thought that if I could keep you close. An agent opened the door, signaling that time was up. Before Brandon was whisked away, Alexandra grabbed his arm. We need to work together on this. It's the only way to find out the truth. That evening, as the city buzzed with news of the scandal, Alexandra sat in her apartment, surrounded by files and memories. An old photo caught her eye. She, as a child, with her father in Central Park. Her eyes were fixed on something outside the frame, and her father was holding her protectively. Her phone vibrated with a message from Grace. I found something in the old archives. You need to see it. Now, the truth Alexandra was discovering was like a jigsaw puzzle where each piece revealed only showed how many more remained to be found. And somewhere, hidden in the shadows of power, someone was watching her movements, planning the next move in a game that had begun long before she was born. Grace was waiting for Alexandra in her office at Winters Communications, the building practically empty at that time of night. On the computer screen, an email dated 5 years ago glowed ominously. I found this on an old backup of the server, Grace explained as Alexandra approached. It's an email exchange between your father in an encrypted address. The interesting thing is the date. Exactly 3 hours before he died, Alexandra added, leaning over to read. The email was short but revealing. JW, Operation Hydra needs to be stopped. Senator Morrison is involved up to his neck. I have the evidence in a Zurich safe. Code 847, VKP 92. If anything happens to me, you know what to do. Alexandra murmured. Robert Foster? Brandon's father, Grace confirmed. Apparently, he and his father were working together to expose something much bigger than money laundering. Alexandra sat back, her mind processing the implications. Senator James Morrison was one of the most powerful politicians in Washington, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. Her phone vibrated. It was an unknown number. Hello, Alexandra? Brandon's voice sounded tense. I got 5 minutes on the phone. We need to talk about Operation Hydra. How did you? My father left a file. It was programmed to be sent to me in case anything happened to him. I received it this afternoon in prison. Alexandra exchanged glances with Grace. The safe in Zurich, yes. The real evidence is there. What the FBI has is just the tip of the iceberg. An interference noise briefly interrupted the call. Brandon, are you saying that our parents, they were working together to expose a network of corruption that goes all the way to Washington? The problem is that someone found out. And now, the connection dropped. Alexander stood up abruptly. Grace, I need you to access all my father's travel records to Switzerland for the last 5 years. I'm already on it, Grace replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard. But Alexandra, if Senator Morrison really is involved, that's why we need to outsmart them. Alexandra grabbed her coat. Keep looking. I'm going to pay someone a visit. 40 minutes later, Alexandra was parked in front of a modest house in Queens. Michael Reynolds opened the door before she even knocked. I knew you'd come, he said, ushering her inside. Did you find out about Operation Hydra? Why didn't you tell me the truth from the beginning? Michael poured 2 cups of coffee. Because the less you knew, the more convincing your investigation would be. We needed everyone to believe that you were acting out of revenge, not as part of a larger operation. And Brandon, is he really guilty? Brandon committed crimes, yes. But like his father, he was trying to protect something bigger. Michael picked up a laptop. Look at this. On the screen, A complex network of transactions showed how billions of dollars were moved through various companies, all connected in some way to Senator Morrison. The Foster empire was used as a front, Michael explained. Morrison needed legitimate companies to launder money from international corruption schemes. Your father discovered this when a noise at the front door interrupted his explanation. Michael instantly drew his gun. Back exit, he whispered. Now, Alexandra grabbed her laptop and followed Michael through the kitchen. When they reached the backyard, headlights illuminated the area. Damn, Michael muttered. They got us surrounded. Who are they? Not the FBI. Michael checked his gun. Alexandra listened carefully. There's a safe in Zurich that a shot rang out through the window, shattering the glass. Michael pushed Alexandra behind a workbench. The code, Alexandra shouted over the noise. I need the code for the safe. A47, VKP, 92, Michael replied, returning fire. But you need, more gunfire interrupted his words. Alexandra, crouched behind the workbench, typed frantically into her phone, sending a message to Grace with the code. We need to get out of here, Michael said, reloading his gun. There's a maintenance tunnel that leads to the subway. It's our only chance. Just as he finished speaking, the back door exploded. Through the smoke, Alexandra saw figures in black advancing. Rot, Michael shouted, providing cover. Alexandra ran towards the basement, laptop held tightly against her chest. Behind her, the sound of gunfire and screams echoed through the house. When she reached the tunnel, she hesitated. Michael, there was no answer. With tears in her eyes, she entered the dark tunnel, knowing that each step took her deeper into a conspiracy that had already cost many lives. The laptop in her arms contained truths that could bring down some of the most powerful men in the country. As she ran through the darkness, Alexandra vowed that Michael's death, as well as those of her father and Robert Foster, would not be in vain. The truth had to come out, no matter what the cost. Somewhere above her, in the city that never sleeps, powerful cogs were beginning to move. Time was running out, and Alexandra Winters had just become the most wanted person in New York. The New York subway never looked as sinister as it did that night. Alexandra ran through the maintenance tunnels, her footsteps echoing against the damp walls, her laptop pressed against her chest like a shield. The gunshots at Michael's house were still ringing in her ears, along with his last command, run. Her phone vibrated. It was Grace. Alexandra, thank God. Where are you? Somewhere under line 7, she replied, trying to control her breathing. Grace, Michael, I know. It's already on the news. Former FBI agent found dead in home after apparent break-in. Alexandra leaned against a wall, letting her body slide to the floor. They're cleaning up loose ends. First my father, then Robert Foster, now Michael. There's more, Grace continued, her voice tense. Brandon Foster was transferred an hour ago to a maximum security penitentiary in upstate New York. What? Why? Officially, for his own protection. But it's easier to make accidents happen away from the spotlight, Alexandra added, a shiver running down her spine. The distant sound of footsteps made Alexandra stand up quickly. Grace, I need you to do something. Use the code I sent you and access all flight records to Zurich for the last 5 years. Look for any connection to Senator Morrison. I've already started the search. But Alexandra, you need to know, I received an anonymous email 10 minutes ago. It contains photos of your father with Morrison at a private estate in Vermont, 3 days before his death. Alexandra processed the information as she moved silently through the tunnel. Send those photos to my secure contacts. And Grace, be careful. Don't trust anyone. Emerging into an abandoned subway station, Alexandra checked its location. It was near Long Island City, Queens. She needed a safe place to examine the contents of Michael's laptop. Her phone rang again, an unknown number. Ms. Winters, a familiar female voice spoke. It was Agent Coleman from the FBI. We need to talk. I'm alone at the Astoria Cafe on 30th Avenue. 15 minutes. How do I know I can trust you? Because I was Michael's partner when he started this investigation 6 years ago. And because I have something you need to see. Alexandra weighed up her options. Every move now could be a trap, but it could also be the key to unraveling everything. In the Astoria Cafe, Coleman occupied a table at the back, his back to the wall, eyes constantly monitoring the entrances. When Alexandra entered, she immediately noticed that the agent was without her badge and regulation gun. "We don't have much time," Coleman began as soon as Alexandra sat down. "The Bureau is committed. Morrison has people at every level. Why are you helping me?" Coleman slid a USB stick across the table. "Because Michael trusted you. And because this goes far beyond money laundering. Morrison isn't just moving illegal money around. He's financing operations that could destabilize entire governments." Alexandra put the pen drive away. "The safe in Zurich. It contains enough evidence to bring down half of Congress. Your father and Robert Foster discovered it by accident when they were investigating irregularities in their own companies. They thought they could expose everything discreetly, but a suspicious movement near the window made Coleman stop abruptly. "We got company. Back exit now." As they stood up, Alexander saw two men in suits enter through the front door. In the reflection of the window, two more approached from the back. Coleman pulled a spare gun from his ankle. "When I say now, run to the kitchen. There's a fire escape. What about you?" "I'll buy time. Michael gave his life to protect this information. I won't let it be in vain." The men approached, their hands moving discreetly towards their concealed weapons. "Now!" Coleman shouted, knocking over a table as a barrier as Alexandra ran into the kitchen. Gunshots echoed behind her, mixed with the screams of panicked customers. Alexandra ran up the fire escape, her heart hammering against her chest. On the roof, she could see the lights of Manhattan shining against the night sky, each hiding its own secrets and lies. Her phone vibrated with a message from Grace. "I found the Zurich records. You won't believe my findings. Meet me at the place where it all began." Alexandra knew exactly where to go. Her father's office at Winters Communications, where she had found the first signs of this conspiracy months ago. Where it all began, and where perhaps it would all end. As she moved across the rooftops of Queens, police sirens filled the night. Somewhere in the city, Brandon Foster was being transported to an uncertain destination. In Washington, Senator Morrison was probably already being briefed on the latest developments. Time was running out, and Alexandra knew that her next decision could be the difference between exposing the truth or joining the growing list of victims of this deadly conspiracy. Jonathan Winters' office had remained untouched since his death, like a corporate shrine preserved in time. Alexandra used her access card to enter the 45th floor of Winters Communications, her footsteps echoing across the marble floor of the empty corridor. Grace was already there, her face illuminated by her laptop screen. Zurich's records show that Senator Morrison has made 17 trips in the last 5 years, always coinciding with large international bank transfers. "What else?" Alexander asked, closing the door quietly behind her. "Your father and Robert Foster had a ghost consulting company in common, Paradise Solutions, LLC. It seems they used it as a cover to track Morrison's movements." Alexandra connected Michael's laptop to a larger monitor. "We need to cross-reference this information with what Michael discovered." As the files loaded, Alexandra noticed something strange, a small red light flashing under her father's desk. Her heart froze. "Grace, stop everything. Now!" "What?" "Listening devices." Alexandra pointed at the light. "They knew we were coming here." A noise in the corridor confirmed her fears. Grace quickly disconnected the equipment while Alexandra looked for an escape route. The office was on the 45th floor. There were many options. "The maintenance duct," Grace whispered, pointing to a grill on the wall. "It leads up to the technical floor." They had barely removed the grill when the first attempt to break in began. Alexandra pushed Grace into the duct first, handing her the laptops before entering herself. The office door burst open just as Alexandra was closing the grill. Through the gaps, she saw armed men entering, their precise movements indicating military training. "Clear," one of them announced. "But they're still around." Alexandra and Grace crept silently through the duct, each movement calculated not to make a sound. Alexandra's heart was pounding so loudly that she feared it might be heard. Her phone vibrated. A message from a block number. Vault B13. Zurich Central Bank. The truth about your father is in there. BF. Brandon. Somehow, he had managed to send a message even from the maximum security prison. Grace signaled an exit ahead. They emerged onto the technical floor, between generators and air conditioning equipment. "We need to separate," Alexander said, handing Grace one of the laptops. "You know the contingency protocol?" "Alexander, no. It's too dangerous. If anything happens to me, hand everything over to Agent Coleman. She's our only reliable ally in the FBI right now." The sound of a door opening made them crouch behind a generator. Methodical footsteps approached. "Grace, take the emergency stairs. Now. In you. I'll create a distraction. Meet me at the Alpha site in 24 hours. Before Grace could protest, Alexandra emerged from her hiding place, moving in the opposite direction and purposely making noise. The footsteps changed direction, following her. Alexandra ran among the equipment, her mind cataloging every detail of the technical floor her father had shown her years ago. "Always know all the exits," he'd said. "One day it could save your life." Arriving at an external maintenance access door, Alexandra entered the code her father had taught her. The door opened with a soft click, revealing a maintenance walkway that circled the building. The strong wind at 45 stories high whipped her face as she moved carefully along the narrow walkway. Below, the lights of Manhattan created an ocean of neon and shadows. Her phone vibrated again, another unknown number. "Ms. Winters," the deep voice was familiar. "This is Senator Morrison. I think we need to talk." Alexander felt her blood run cold. "About how you had my father killed?" "Your father wasn't murdered, Alexandra. He killed himself when he realized that his investigations would put you in danger." "That's a lie. I have the video of his last conversation with me. Do you want to see it?" Alexander clutched the phone tightly. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you're following in his footsteps and I don't want it to end the same way. Come and find me. Alone. I'll explain everything." "Where?" "Cathedral of St. John the Divine. 1 hour. Come alone, or the next body they find will be that of your friend Grace." The call ended, leaving Alexandra alone with the wind and her doubts. Her father? Suicide? It didn't make sense. Or did it? As she carefully descended the external emergency staircase, Alexandra weighed up her options. Morrison was obviously lying, but what if there was a grain of truth? What if her father really had discovered something so terrible that he would rather die than put his daughter at risk? On the floor, Alexandra checked Grace's messages confirming her safe escape. The laptop with the evidence was on its way to safety. Now she had a decision to make. Find Morrison and possibly fall into a trap, or keep running and risk losing the only chance of discovering the truth about her father. A cab drove slowly down the street. Alexandra raised her hand. "Cathedral of St. John the Divine," she said to the driver, knowing that she could be heading for her own death trap. The cab plunged into Manhattan's night traffic, taking Alexandra towards the next act of this deadly drama that had begun 5 years ago with her father's death. The truth, she knew, had a price. It remained to be seen whether she was prepared to pay it. The Cathedral of St. John the Divine stood imposingly against the Manhattan night sky, its Gothic towers casting elongated shadows over the stone steps. Alexandra climbed the steps slowly, each step echoing with the weight of the revelations that awaited her. The interior of the cathedral was practically empty, except for a few flickering candles and the solitary figure of Senator Morrison, sitting in one of the front pews. He didn't turn around when Alexander approached, his eyes fixed on the altar in front of him. "Your father was a complicated man," Morrison began, his voice reverberating softly through the sacred space. "Brilliant, idealistic, but sometimes dangerously naive." "Why here?" Alexander asked, keeping a calculated distance. Morrison finally turned to face her. His face, normally confident in television appearances, looked tired in the candlelight. "Because this is where I had my last real conversation with Jonathan. He used to come here to think." Alexandra watched the exits discreetly as Morrison removed a tablet from his jacket pocket. This video was recorded the night before he died. On the screen, Jonathan Winters appeared sitting in his office, looking exhausted. "If you're watching this, Alexandra, it means I made the only choice I had left to protect you. What we've discovered goes beyond Morrison, beyond a government. There are people who would do anything to keep it buried." "Why am I only seeing this now?" Alexandra asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Because your father made me promise that I would only show it to you when you reached the same point he did." Morrison slid an envelope across the surface of the bench. "These are the exact coordinates of the vault in Zurich. The documents inside aren't just about money laundering. They're about a global operation involving intelligence agencies, multinational corporations, and political figures from several countries. And you're part of it. I was his contact in the government. Jonathan thought we could expose everything through official channels." Morrison laughed bitterly. He didn't understand that there are no official channels anymore. The whole system is compromised. A noise at the back of the cathedral made Alexandra tense up, but Morrison held up his hand in a reassuring gesture. "My men are keeping other interested parties away from here. We have a few minutes. Why are you helping me now?" "Because your father was right. What started out as a legitimate intelligence operation has turned into something monstrous. And now," Morrison checked his watch, "now they're planning something that will make the 2008 financial crisis look like child's play." Alexandra picked up the envelope, her fingers rubbing heavy paper. "Did Brandon know about this?" "Robert Foster told him a few details before he died. That's why Brandon continued the operations. Not to profit, but to keep access to the information." Morrison stood up slowly. "He's in prison now because he refused to cooperate with the next stage of the plan." Footsteps echoed through the cathedral, this time closer. Morrison tensed. "Our time is up. There's a car waiting at the side exit. The driver has instructions to take you to a safe place." "Why should I trust you?" "Because I owe it to your father. And because," Morrison hesitated, "because my daughter would be your age now, if they hadn't made it look like a car accident 10 years ago." Before Alexandra could process this revelation, the main doors of the cathedral opened violently. Morrison pushed her towards the side exit. "Go." And Alexandra, he reached into his pocket again, handing her a small device. "This opens a secure server in Geneva. Use only as a last resort." Alexandra ran out the side exit as sounds of fighting echoed behind her. A black Audi was waiting with its engine running. As she got into the car, she recognized the driver. It was one of the agents working with Coleman. "Where to?" she asked as the car sped down Amsterdam Avenue. "Private airport in New Jersey. There's a plane waiting for Zurich." Alexandra looked back, seeing emergency lights converging on the cathedral. In her pocket, Morrison's envelope weighed like lead, carrying secrets that had cost the lives of her father and so many others. His phone vibrated with a message from Grace. "Document secure. Coleman confirmed federal protection. Be careful." The car snaked through Manhattan's night traffic, each kilometer taking Alexandra away from the world she knew and bringing her closer to truths that could change everything. She opened the envelope, studying the coordinates on the safe as the city lights danced through the tinted windows. Somewhere behind them, Morrison was facing the consequences of his choice. In a maximum security prison, Brandon Foster awaited his next move. And in Zurich, a vault held secrets that people would kill or die to protect. The small private airport in Teterboro, New Jersey, was an oasis of calm compared to the chaos Alexandra had left behind in Manhattan. The Gulfstream G650 was waiting on the tarmac, its turbines already idling, ready to cross the Atlantic. "Miss Winters," the pilot greeted her on the plane's stairs. "Take off in 5 minutes. Estimated time to Zurich, 7 hours and 40 minutes. Inside the luxurious cabin, Alexandra found a briefcase on one of the leather seats. Inside were travel documents and a perfectly crafted fake ID. Amanda Peterson would be her name for the next few hours. Her phone vibrated one last time before she had to turn it off for takeoff. It was a message from a block number. "B13 has a biometric system. It needs 2 specific fingerprints to open. Your father was one. Guess who the other is? RM. Robert Morrison." The senator had planned everything, even before their meeting in the cathedral. Alexandra felt the plane begin to taxi. the lights of New York gradually dimming through the window. "Miss Peterson," a flight attendant approached. "There's someone who'd like to speak to you in the secure cabin." Alexandra followed the flight attendant to a small communications room at the back of the plane. On the video conferencing screen, Brandon Foster's face appeared, clearly no longer in prison. "How?" "Let's just say I have friends in interesting places," Brandon replied, his face marked by fresh bruises. "Morrison managed to get me out before they tried to silence me permanently." "Why are you helping me?" "Because my father died trying to expose the truth, just like yours. And because," Brandon hesitated, "because when I proposed that marriage, it wasn't just out of convenience. I really wanted to protect you." The plane reached cruising altitude, the gentle turbulence reminding Alexandra of the precariousness of her situation. "The safe in Zurich," she began. "Morrison says he needs 2 fingerprints." "Yes, his father, and he set up a double security system. If something happened to one of them, the other could still access the evidence with the help of the designated heir." "Me?" "Exactly. Your fingerprint combined with Morrison's will open the safe." "But Alexandra," Brandon looked at something off-screen. "We have company. 3 private jets took off from LaGuardia right after you. And they're not tourists." Alexandra felt her stomach sink. "How long until they reach us?" "If they maintain their current speed, 2 hours. But the biggest problem isn't in the air, it's in Zurich. They have people in the bank." "How do you know that?" "Because I was one of them, remember? I know the protocols." Brandon typed something into his computer. "I'm sending you the layout of the bank and the times of the security shift changes. There's a 15-minute window during the lunch break." The commissioner knocked softly on the door. "Miss Peterson, we have an urgent transmission coming in." On the secondary screen, Grace's tense face appeared. "Alexandra, Coleman is dead. FBI ambush. The files are safe," but her voice faltered. "Morrison too, in the cathedral. I know," Alexandra replied, feeling the weight of 2 more lives lost. "Are you safe?" "Yes, underground. But there's more. I discovered something in Michael's files. The operation they're planning is for tomorrow." Brandon cursed softly. "The financial crash." "Worse," Grace continued. "They're going to use the market chaos as a smokescreen for something bigger. Something involving military installations, and..." The transmission cut out abruptly. Alexandra looked at Brandon, who was already typing furiously. "We need a new plan," he said. "The bank opens at 9. Even if you get there on time, they'll be waiting. Then let's give them what they're waiting for." Alexandra picked up the device Morrison had given her. "The server in Geneva. What if we use it as a distraction?" Brandon completed her thought. "Make them think the evidence is there, while I enter the bank through the back door." Alexandra studied the floor plan Brandon had sent her. "There's a service entrance that leads directly to the vault level. It's risky. Everything in this story is risky." Alexandra looked out of the cabin's small window, the dark ocean below seeming to swallow up the last lights of the American coast. "How many more people have to die before this is over?" Brandon was silent for a moment. "I'll create the distraction in Geneva." But Alexandra's eyes met hers through the screen. "If something goes wrong, it won't." She touched the screen gently where his face was. "We'll meet in Zurich. It's a promise." The transmission ended, leaving Alexandra alone with her thoughts and the soft hum of the turbines. In her bag, the envelope with the coordinates of the safe and Morrison's device weighed like anchors of the truth that her father had died protecting. The pilot announced that they were crossing the Atlantic. In a few hours, Alexandra would be in Zurich, ready to open a safe that contained secrets people would kill for without hesitation. And somewhere over the same ocean, 3 jets were stalking their prey, determined to prevent the truth from coming out. The night would be long, and the next day promised to be even longer. But for the first time since this whole story began, Alexandra felt she was closer than ever to honoring her father's sacrifice. And maybe, just maybe, to finding something she hadn't expected, an ally who had become something more. The sun had barely begun to touch the Swiss Alps when the Gulfstream G650 began its descent towards Zurich International Airport. Alexandra watched the first lights of the city through the cabin window, her reflection in the glass revealing deep circles under her eyes from a sleepless night. "Miss Peterson," The pilot announced over the intercom, using his fake name, landing in 10 minutes. There's a car waiting as requested. Alexandra checked Amanda Peterson's documents once more, memorizing every detail of her new identity. Morrison's device and the coordinates of the safe were safe in a secret compartment in her executive briefcase. Courtesy of Brandon's last instructions. His phone, now with a Swiss chip, vibrated with a coded message. Distraction in Geneva ready. 3 targets have taken the bait. Path clear for 15 minutes. B. The Central Bank of Zurich was a modernist fortress of glass and steel, located in the heart of the financial district. Alexandra studied the bank building from the cafe across the street, appearing to be just another executive starting her working day. Confirmation of movement in Geneva. Brandon's voice sounded in his discreet earpiece. Tactical teams are already moving in. Grace hacked the bank's cameras. You have a clear window to the basement. Alexandra finished her coffee, adjusted her Armani blazer, and crossed the street with the studied confidence of someone who belonged there. Her high heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor as she made her way to the service entrance, previously identified on the bank's plans. Access card working, Brandon confirmed as she passed through the first security door. Service elevator on your left. Underground, the air was noticeably colder. Alexandra made her way down the barren corridor, her footsteps echoing faintly. The private vault area was a labyrinth of identical corridors, purposely designed to confuse intruders. B13, she muttered to herself, locating the safe at the exact coordinates provided by Morrison. The biometric panel glowed softly, awaiting the necessary fingerprints. Alexandra, Brandon's voice sounded urgent in her ear. We have a problem. They've detected the hack in Geneva. They're coming back. Her hands trembled slightly as she positioned her fingers on the scanner. The first set of fingerprints, her own. The panel flashed green. Now came the tricky part. Morrison's fingerprint, preserved on a special film that Brandon had provided. 2 minutes, Brandon warned. Security teams are already returning to the bank. The scanner processed the second fingerprint. Seconds dragged by like hours until, finally, a soft click indicated that the safe had been unlocked. Inside, a single black briefcase and a USB stick. Alexandra quickly transferred the items to her briefcase, but something else caught her eye, a letter addressed to her, in her father's unmistakable handwriting. Alexandra, movement in the lobby. Grace interrupted through the communicator. 4 men, armed, disguised as maintenance staff. There was no time to read the letter now. Alexandra closed the safe and started back, her steps now more hurried. Elevator blocked, Brandon informed her. Use the emergency staircase at the end of the corridor. Alexandra ran, her heels now a handicap. As she reached the stairs, the sound of doors being opened echoed through the basement. She began to climb, each step a mixture of adrenaline and controlled terror. Alexandra, Brandon called out again. There's an emergency exit on the 3rd floor that leads to an alley. Car waiting on Bahnhofstrasse. On the 2nd floor, male voices sounded above her. She was trapped between the 2 teams. Brandon, she whispered, I need another route. 2nd floor window, east side. There's a cleaning scaffold. Alexandra pushed open the 2nd floor door, running through the empty office. The scaffolding swayed dangerously when she stepped on it, but there was no choice. 15 meters down, the alley seemed impossibly far away. Gunshots shattered the windows above her. Alexandra scrambled down the scaffolding as fast as she could, ignoring the trembling in her legs and the cold wind that whipped her face. Car approaching, Brandon warned. 3 meters to your right, as soon as you hit the ground. Her feet finally touched the ground in the alley just as a black Audi skidded into the driveway. The door opened and Alexandra threw herself inside, bullets ricocheting off the metal of the car. Drive, she shouted, but it was no longer necessary. The driver, whom she recognized as one of Brandon's contacts, sped off through the narrow alleys of Zurich. Safe package? Brandon asked in her ear. Yes, Alexandra replied, feeling the weight of the suitcase on her lap. And something else? A letter from my father. Silence on the other end of the line, then, I'll meet you at the secondary location in 30 minutes. I think it's time we found out what our parents really died for. The Audi emerged onto the busy Bahnhofstrasse, blending seamlessly into the morning traffic. Alexandra looked at the briefcase on her lap, feeling the weight of the secrets it carried. Secrets for which her father, Robert Foster, Coleman, and so many others had given their lives. In a few hours, those secrets would come to light. But first, there was a letter to read, and Alexandra knew that her father's words could change everything she thought she knew about this deadly conspiracy. The secure apartment in Zurich was a discreet studio on the top floor of a historic building overlooking the Limmat River. Alexandra sat at the worn wooden table, her father's letter in her trembling hands, while Brandon prepared coffee in the small kitchen. "You should read it," Brandon said softly, placing a steaming cup next to her. "We've wasted enough time already." Alexandra opened the envelope carefully, the expensive paper still retaining its distinctive smell after so many years. Her father's elegant handwriting filled 2 pages. "Dear Alexandra, if you're reading this, it means you've come further than I ever could. And it also means that you've probably figured out that my death wasn't natural, just as Robert Foster's wasn't a hard accident. What we have discovered goes beyond simple corporate corruption. Operation Artemis, as it is known in insider circles, began as a financial intelligence project after September 11th. The aim was to create a system that would allow terror's financing to be tracked and intercepted globally. But like so many things born of good intentions, the project was corrupted. Morrison and I were part of the original group, he representing the government, me providing the technological infrastructure through Winter's communications. Robert Foster joined later, when we needed more channels to monitor international transactions. What none of us realized at first was that certain elements within the government itself were using the system not to prevent crimes, but to commit them. Manipulation of global markets, destabilization of entire economies, all under the guise of national security. The crash they're planning isn't just financial, it's a complete reconfiguration of the economic world order. And what's worse, they have access to strategic military installations through the same system we created to protect the country. Brandon doesn't know this, but Robert came to me the night he died. He had discovered something about portable nuclear devices missing from a facility in Nevada. The financial crisis was just a smokescreen for something much more sinister. Alexandra, if you're reading this, it means that Morrison kept his promise. He swore to protect you and ensure that the truth would come out when the time was right. The USB stick in the safe contains all the original access codes for the Artemis system. With them, you can not only expose the truth, but also stop what they are planning. But be careful. The man behind it all, the one who turned our protection tool into a weapon, is someone you know. Someone who has always been hiding in plain sight. Look for Marcus Chun. Yes, the same Marcus who works as Brandon's assistant. He's not who he says he is. His real name is Marcus Zhang, a former Chinese intelligence officer who infiltrated the project from the start. He's been manipulating all of us like pieces on a chessboard. Forgive me for not telling you, sinner. Every choice I made was to protect you, even if it meant letting you think I was just another corrupt executive who took the easy way out. Brandon is trustworthy. Robert made sure of that before he died. You two together have the chance that we didn't have to do the right thing. I love you more than anything, Dad. Alexandra looked up from the letter, finding Brandon watching her intently. "Marcus," she whispered. "All this time what?" Brandon picked up the letter, his eyes running down the lines. His face paled visibly. "Impossible. Marcus has been working with me for years, long enough to orchestrate everything." Alexandra opened her briefcase, taking out the pen drive. "And now he knows exactly where we are?" As if to confirm her words, an explosion shook the building. Alarms began to sound everywhere. "Back exit," Brandon commanded, picking up the briefcase while Alexandra put the letter away. "We have 3 minutes before the stairs are completely blocked." They ran into the smoky corridor, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing a few floors below. Alexandra kicked off her heels for a better run, following Brandon through the increasingly dense smoke. "The roof," he shouted over the noise of the alarms. "There's a catwalk to the building next door." As they climbed the last few flights of stairs, Alexandra couldn't help thinking about how everything connected. Her father, Robert Foster, Morrison, all trying to prevent a catastrophe that went far beyond money and power. And now, running for her life alongside the man who was supposed to be her enemy, she finally understood the true meaning of legacy. It wasn't about corporate empires or reputations, but about doing the right thing when no one else could. The cold morning air hit them as they emerged onto the roof. In the distance, sirens announced the arrival of the Swiss police. But Alexandra knew it wouldn't be the police they'd find first. Marcus was already several steps ahead, as he always was. The piercing wind from the roof buzzed in Alexandra's ears as she and Brandon assessed the metal walkway that connected the two buildings. 3 floors below, Swiss police sirens mingled with the chaos of the building's evacuation. The pin drive, Brandon held out his hand. "We need to crack the codes before Marcus gets to us." Alexandra connected the device to the laptop Brandon was carrying, both taking cover behind an air conditioning unit while the data loaded. The screen flashed with a series of encrypted files, each marked with a specific date. Here, Alexandra pointed to a file called Artemisiter's. "My father mentioned that the original codes could stop what they're planning." Sounds of footsteps in the emergency stairwell made Brandon speed up his typing. "We need a password, something your father and mine would have shared." Alexandra thought of the video of her father with Robert Foster at the gala. "Try Paradise Solutions." Negative. Brandon tried again. "We need to think about how they thought. What was important to both of them?" A metal door slammed on the floor below. Alexandra closed her eyes, remembering the letter. "Try New Order 2008, the year the project began." The file opened, revealing lines and lines of code. Brandon quickly began copying the data to a second device, while Alexandra stood guard. "Alexandra," a familiar voice echoed through the roof. "It doesn't have to end like this." Marcus Chun emerged from the stairwell door, his usual impeccable suit replaced by black tactical clothing. In his hand, a pistol with a silencer pointed directly at them. 15 years preparing this," Marcus continued, his voice as calm as ever. "Perfect infiltration. No one ever suspected the dedicated assistant, always behind the scenes." "Why?" Brandon asked, his voice betraying a mixture of anger and betrayal. "You were like a brother to me." "Because sometimes you have to destroy a system to rebuild it better." Marcus stepped forward. "The financial crash is just the beginning. When the missing warheads detonate at strategic points, the chaos will create the perfect opportunity for a new world order." Alexandra felt her blood run cold. "The military installations my father mentioned." "Your father was brilliant," Marcus admitted. "So was Robert Foster. They created the perfect system for tracking suspicious movements. Ironic that this same system allowed us to create the necessary blind spots." A helicopter appeared on the horizon, its booming noise filling the morning air. Brandon discreetly signaled that the data transfer was almost complete. "It won't work," Alexandra said, stepping sideways to keep Marcus' attention on herself. "The original codes can still revert access to the system." Marcus laughed softly. "Why do you think I'm here in person?" And he checked his watch. "Exactly 47 minutes, the first phase will start. Not even the original codes will be able to stop it." The helicopter was closer now, and Alexandra recognized the Swiss police logo on its side. But something in Marcus' smile made her realize that this was also part of his plan. "It's not a police helicopter," she muttered to Brandon. "I know." Brandon closed his laptop. 3 minutes until the transfer is complete." Marcus took another step forward. "I've always admired your intelligence, Alexandra. You and Brandon would have been valuable assets in the new order." But now he raised his gun. The sound of breaking glass came from the building next door, followed by a flash of light. A tactical team emerged from the windows of the adjacent building, guns drawn. "FBI," a familiar voice shouted. "Marcus Jean, you're surrounded." Agent Coleman, very much alive and definitely not dead as they had thought, led the team, her bulletproof vest displaying the insignia of the International Task Force. Marcus turned quickly, firing towards the agents as he ran to the edge of the roofs. The helicopter approached, a rope ladder unfurling. "Transfer complete," Brandon shouted over the chaos of gunfire and rotors. Alexandra watched Marcus grab the helicopter's ladder, his confident smile still on his face. But there was something he didn't know, something she had realized from reading the latest files. The codes, she shouted to Brandon as Coleman and his team advanced. They're not just for reversing access. They're for completely deactivate, Brandon finished, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The entire Artemis system. Marcus' smile finally faltered as the lights on his phone began to flash frantically. All over the world, at that very moment, carefully crafted blind spots were being exposed, every suspicious transaction revealed, every plan uncovered. The helicopter began to move away, taking Marcus with it, but Alexandra knew it didn't matter anymore. The truth, as her father had predicted, was finally coming out. Coleman approached them, holstering his gun. Good work. Teams in 5 different countries are moving against the conspirators as we speak. How? Alexander began. Morrison, Coleman explained. He planned everything before he died. His death in the cathedral was part of the plan to allow me to operate in the shadows. But we didn't have the codes until now. The afternoon sun bathed Central Park as Alexander sat on the same bench where, years ago, her father used to take her for ice cream. 2 weeks had passed since the events in Zurich, and the world was still processing the revelations that had shaken governments in global markets. Brandon approached, carrying 2 coffees from the nearby cart. His casual suit and more relaxed posture reflected the recent changes in his life. Foster Enterprises was under new management, a temporary board of directors while the investigations continued. They've located Marcus, he said, handing Alexandra one of the coffees. Chinese authorities found him in a remote province. Apparently, not even his former employers were happy with the idea of lost nuclear warheads. Alexander nodded, watching a group of children playing by the lake. What about the military installations? All the warheads have been recovered. Coleman's team worked day and night to trace each device using the codes we recovered. Brandon paused, taking a sip of coffee. It's strange to think that our parents built something so powerful with the intention of protecting people. And how everything can be corrupted in the wrong hands, Alexander added, thinking of her father's letter. Grace has finished processing the last files from the Artemis system. There were sleeper cells in at least a dozen countries, all waiting for the signal to start global financial chaos. A balloon vendor passed them, his colorful merchandise dancing against the blue Manhattan sky. Alexander smiled as she remembered how her father always bought her a red balloon from that very spot. Winters Communications? Brandon asked softly. Under restructuring, the board wants me to take over as president. Alexandra turned to face him. What about you? Are you going to fight for control of Foster Enterprises? Brandon contemplated the question for a moment. Maybe it's time to build something new, something our parents would be proud of. His phone vibrated. It was Coleman. We found another file hidden on the Geneva server. You need to see it. Minutes later, they were in the FBI's temporary office in Manhattan, watching a video recorded by Robert Foster and Jonathan Winters together, apparently shortly before their deaths. If you're watching this, Robert Foster began, it means you've done it. Alexandra, Brandon, you're proof that we did at least one thing right. We raised children with the courage to face the truth. The Artemis system, Jonathan Winters continued, was our attempt to create a safer world. But we learned the hard way that security without transparency is just another form of tyranny. That's why we've left one last gift, Robert smiled. A new algorithm buried in the original code, not just to track suspicious activity, but to ensure that no one, government or corporation, can hide illegal transactions again. The video ended, leaving the room in contemplative silence. Coleman was the first to speak. The algorithm is already active. 3 senators resigned this morning when they realized that their activities were being exposed automatically. Alexandra felt Brandon's hand find hers under the table. A simple gesture, but one charged with shared understanding. They had started out as supposed enemies, brought together by a fake marriage proposal, only to discover that their fates were intertwined by something much bigger. So, what do we do now? Alexander asked, even though she already knew the answer. We continue their work, Brandon replied, but the right way this time, transparent, honest. Coleman smiled, handing them a folder. The Bureau could use consultants with your experience, especially now that we're expanding the Financial Crimes Task Force. As they left the FBI building, the city looked different. Not just the scene of an unraveled conspiracy, but a place of renewed possibilities. Grace was waiting for them on the sidewalk, smiling. "The new office is ready," she announced. "Paradise Solutions 2.0, consulting in financial security and corporate transparency." Alexandra looked at Brandon, seeing in his eyes the same glint of determination she had known that first night at Per Se, when he had made his inadequate proposal. "You know," he said, "I still think we should get married." "Because of reputation?" Alexandra teased. "No," Brandon smiled, that genuine smile she had learned to love. "Because some partnerships are destined to change the world." The sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, painting the skyscrapers in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere, Alexandra knew, her father in Robert Foster would be proud. Not just for having exposed the truth, but for having found something more valuable in the process. A shared purpose and a love born from the ashes of the conspiracy that tried to destroy them. "Yes," Alexandra replied, entwining her fingers in Brandon's. "Some partnerships are." And so, where one story of betrayal and secrets ended, another of redemption and purpose began. Their parents' legacy would live on not only in the codes and systems they had created, but in their children's commitment to truth and justice. The world had changed, and they had changed with it. But some things like love, honor, and the search for truth would remain eternal, passed down from one generation to the next as a silent testament that, even in the darkest hours, light always finds a way.